Lonely Rancher helped a native girl escape from hunters. The next day, the warriors of the tribe arrived at his ranch. The coffee was still steaming in his tin cup when Jacob Morrison heard the first shot echo across the Wyoming Badlands. It came from the North Canyon, sharp and violent in the morning stillness, followed immediately by another, then another. Jacob set down his cup and listened to the sound bouncing off the red rock walls like an accusation. At 51, Jacob had heard enough gunfire to know the difference between hunting and something darker. These shots had the rapid, desperate quality of pursuit rather than the measured pace of men tracking game. Someone was running for their life, and someone else was determined to stop them. Jacob grabbed his rifle from beside the cabin door and climbed onto his roof for a better view. His ranch sat in a box canyon surrounded by towering sandstone formations, isolated enough that he sometimes went months without seeing another human soul. That isolation had been his salvation after Helena, after the trial that had destroyed his reputation and driven him into the wilderness. For 6 years, he had lived in blessed solitude, tending his small herd and trying to forget that the world existed beyond these canyon walls. But the world had a way of intruding, even here. Another volley of shots rang out, closer now, followed by the sound of horses moving fast through the rocky terrain. Jacob could see dust clouds rising from the narrow trail that led into his canyon, the only way in or out of his hidden refuge. Whatever was happening, it was heading straight toward him. Jacob climbed down and positioned himself behind a cluster of boulders that provided cover, while still allowing him a clear view of the trail. His hands, scarred from years of ranch work, gripped the rifle with steady familiarity. 6 years of isolation had not dulled his instincts for danger. The first horse to appear around the bend was a pinto pony, small and swift, ridden by someone hunched low over its neck. Even at this distance, Jacob could see that the rider was young and desperate, pushing the horse beyond its limits in a race for survival. Behind them, perhaps a quarter-mile back, came the pursuit. 3 riders on larger horses, gaining ground with every stride. As the fleeing rider drew closer, details became clear that made Jacob's blood run cold. The figure was a young Native American woman, probably Apache based on the style of her clothing and the way she rode. She could not have been more than 18, with long black hair streaming behind her like a war banner. Blood stained her buckskin dress, though whether from injury or other causes was impossible to tell from this distance. The men pursuing her were white, and they rode with the grim determination of hunters closing in on wounded prey. Jacob could see rifles in their hands and something in their faces that spoke of intentions far worse than simple capture. These were not lawmen pursuing a criminal. These were predators chasing sport. The young woman's horse stumbled as it hit the loose shale near the canyon entrance, nearly throwing her from the saddle. She managed to stay mounted, but the stumble cost her precious seconds. Her pursuers were close enough now that Jacob could hear their voices, cruel laughter mixing with shouted threats that made his stomach turn. Jacob had perhaps 30 seconds to make a decision that would change everything. He could stay hidden behind his rocks and let events play out without his involvement. The smart choice, the safe choice, was to remain invisible and uninvolved. He had learned the hard way that trying to help people often led to nothing but trouble. But as he watched the terror in the young woman's face, as he heard the ugly promises her pursuers were making about what they would do when they caught her, Jacob found that some lines could not be crossed without response. Some things demanded action regardless of the consequences. The young woman's horse stumbled again as she tried to navigate the rocky approach to Jacob's cabin. This time she did fall, rolling hard across the stone-littered ground, while her horse limped away with what was clearly a pulled tendon. She scrambled to her feet and ran toward Jacob's cabin, but her pursuers were too close. There was nowhere left to run. Jacob stepped out from behind his rocks and fired a warning shot into the air. The sharp crack echoed off the canyon walls like thunder, and all 4 riders pulled up short. The 3 men turned to stare at him with expressions of surprise and annoyance, as if he were an unexpected obstacle to their entertainment. "That is far enough," Jacob called out, his voice carrying clearly in the thin mountain air. "The lady is under my protection now." The leader of the 3 men, a heavy-set brute with a beard stained by tobacco juice, laughed as if Jacob had told a particularly amusing joke. "Lady? Hell, mister, that ain't no lady. That is just a dirty squaw who stole from us. We are taking back what is ours. Jacob studied the young woman who now stood behind him, noting the way she held herself with dignity, despite her obvious fear. Her dark eyes met his for a moment, and he saw intelligence there, and gratitude, but also a warning. She understood better than he did what these men were capable of. "I do not see any stolen property," Jacob said, keeping his rifle trained on the three riders. "I see a young woman who needs help, and three men who look like they have been drinking too much and thinking too little." The second man, lean and wiry with dead eyes that belonged on a snake, spat into the dust. "You do not know what you are talking about, old man. That squaw killed a white woman in Laramie. We are bounty hunters bringing her to justice." Jacob looked at the young woman again, studying her face for any sign of guilt or deception. What he saw instead was the kind of weary resignation that came from being accused of crimes she had not committed simply because of the color of her skin. "If you are lawmen, show me your badges," Jacob said. "Show me a warrant or some other proof of your authority." The three men exchanged glances, and Jacob saw something pass between them that confirmed his suspicions. These were not bounty hunters or lawmen. They were something far worse. "We do not need badges to deal with murdering Indians," the third man said. He was younger than the other two, with the cruel prettiness of someone who had never faced real consequences for his actions. "And we do not need permission from some hermit hiding in the rocks." Jacob felt the familiar cold calm that had served him well during his years as a lawman settle over his mind. "You are on my property now. That gives me certain rights under territorial law. The right to defend my land and anyone who seeks sanctuary on it." "Sanctuary?" The heavy-set leader laughed again. "Mister, you are making a big mistake. There are three of us and one of you. Those are not good odds for an old man with delusions of heroism." "The odds are not as bad as you think," Jacob replied, and there was something in his voice that made all three men pay closer attention. "I spent 15 years wearing a badge in some very unpleasant places. I know the difference between lawman and trash. You gentlemen fall into the second category." The young woman stepped closer to Jacob, and he could hear her whispering something in what sounded like Apache. He could not understand the words, but the tone was clear. She was warning him about these men, telling him that they were more dangerous than they appeared. "Last chance, old man," the snake-eyed rider said, his hand drifting toward his sidearm. "Step aside and let us take what is ours, or we will take you down along with the squaw." Jacob's response was to lever another round into his rifle chamber, the metallic sound echoing ominously off the canyon walls. "I have a different suggestion. You turn around and ride out of my canyon, right now, before I decide that you represent a threat that needs to be eliminated." The tension stretched taut as a bowstring as the three men weighed their options. Jacob could see them calculating odds, studying his position, looking for advantages. They were used to intimidating isolated settlers, but something in Jacob's manner suggested that intimidation would not work here. The decision was made for them when the young woman suddenly called out in clear English, her voice carrying across the canyon with surprising strength. "They killed my family 3 days ago. Murdered them for sport, then burned our camp. I am the only one who escaped to tell what really happened." The words hit Jacob like a physical blow. These were not bounty hunters pursuing a criminal. They were murderers cleaning up loose ends, eliminating the only witness to their crimes. The heavy-set leader's face darkened with rage. "Shut your lying mouth, squaw, before I shut it for you. The truth has a way of surfacing," Jacob said quietly. "Especially when innocent blood has been spilled." "Innocent?" The pretty boy laughed. "Indians ain't innocent. They are savages, and the only good Indian is a dead Indian. We are just doing what the government does not have the backbone to do." Jacob had heard such rhetoric before, usually from men who used ideology to justify their own cruelty. "The government did not authorize you to murder families. You did that all on your own." The standoff stretched for another long moment. 3 armed men on horseback facing 1 man on foot with a single rifle. By all logic, the odds favored the mounted men, but Jacob had positioned himself well, using the canyon walls to limit their angles of attack. More importantly, he had the calm confidence of someone who had faced such moments before and survived them. Finally, the snake-eyed rider made his move. His hand darted toward his pistol with practiced speed, but Jacob was already in motion. The rifle barked once, and the man toppled from his saddle with a scream of pain, clutching a shattered shoulder. The other two men cursed and spurred their horses forward, but the narrow canyon worked against them. They could not spread out to flank Jacob, and their horses struggled with the rocky footing. Jacob worked the lever action of his rifle with smooth efficiency, placing his next shot close enough to the pretty boy's head that rock chips from the canyon wall drew blood from his cheek. "Next one will not be a warning," Jacob called out. The heavy-set leader pulled up short, his face twisted with fury and frustration. "This is not over, old man. We know where you live now. We will be back with more men, and when we come, that squaw will not be the only one who dies." "You are welcome to try," Jacob replied, with a calmness that was more threatening than any shout. "But I should mention that I spent those 15 years as a territorial marshal primarily because I was very good at killing men who needed killing. Some skills you never forget." The threat hung in the air like smoke from a fired gun. The three men looked at their wounded companion, at the blood seeping through his fingers, at the steady rifle barrel that never wavered from its target. Whatever they had expected to find in this remote canyon, it was not a man who could put them down with cold efficiency. Gradually, sense overcame rage. The leader helped his wounded companion back onto his horse, all the while glaring at Jacob with promises of future vengeance. But promises were cheap compared to present reality, and the present reality was that they were outgunned and outmatched. "This is not finished," the leader said as they prepared to withdraw. "Yes, it is," Jacob replied. "It finished the moment you decided to murder innocent people for sport. Everything else is just consequences." The three men rode out of the canyon with their wounded companion slumped over his saddle, leaving behind only dust and the echo of hoofbeats. Jacob kept his rifle trained on them until they disappeared around the bend, then waited another 10 minutes to make sure they were truly gone. Only then did he turn to face the young woman who had brought such dramatic change to his isolated world. She stood near his cabin, no longer the terrified fugitive he had first seen, but a person with dignity and strength that had merely been temporarily overshadowed by circumstances. Up close, he could see that she was indeed very young, perhaps 17 or 18, with the kind of classical beauty that belonged in paintings rather than on wanted posters. "Thank you," she said simply, and there was a weight of meaning in those two words that encompassed not just gratitude for his intervention, but recognition of what it had cost him. "What is your name?" Jacob asked. "Ayana. It means eternal blossom in my language." She managed a small smile despite everything she had endured. "Though I feel more like a flower that has been trampled." "You are Apache?" "Yes. My father is Chief Standing Bear of the Mescalero. Was Chief Standing Bear." Her voice broke slightly on the past tense. "He is dead now, along with my mother and younger brother. All dead because those men wanted to take our horses and thought it would be easier if there were no witnesses." Jacob felt a familiar anger building in his chest, the same righteous fury that had driven him to become a lawman in the first place. "How did you escape?" "I was gathering water at the stream when they attacked. I heard the shooting and hid in the rocks until they left. When I came back," she trailed off, unable to voice the horror of what she had found. Jacob understood. He had seen the aftermath of such attacks during his years in law enforcement. The casual brutality that some men were capable of inflicting on those they considered less than human never failed to sicken him. "They have been hunting me for 3 days," Ayana continued. "I thought I had lost them in the Badlands, but they picked up my trail again this morning." "You are safe now," Jacob said, though even as he spoke the words, he knew they were probably not true. The men who had just left would return, and when they did, they would bring reinforcements. Ayana seemed to read his thoughts. "They will come back. Men like that do not forgive being made to look foolish, and they cannot afford to let me live to tell what I witnessed." Jacob nodded grimly. "How many people know about what happened to your family?" "No one. The attack was in a remote area where my father thought we would be safe. I am the only witness, the only one who can identify the killers." She looked at Jacob with eyes that held wisdom beyond her years. "That makes me very dangerous to them." The political implications were staggering. If Ayana's testimony about the murder of her family became public, it could spark the kind of territorial investigation that would expose the corruption and violence that plagued the frontier. But only if she lived long enough to give that testimony. "You cannot stay here," Jacob said, though the words felt like betrayal, even as he spoke them. "They know where I live now. When they return, It will be with enough men to overwhelm any defense I can mount." "I know," Ayanna said quietly. "I never meant to bring this trouble to your door. If you will loan me a horse, I will leave and try to reach the territorial capital. Perhaps the governor will listen to my story." Jacob studied her face, seeing the determination there but also the exhaustion. She had been running for 3 days, surviving on adrenaline and desperation. The idea of her making the dangerous journey to the capital alone, with professional killers on her trail, was essentially a death sentence. "There is another way," Jacob said slowly, an idea forming in his mind. "But it would require trust on both sides." "What do you mean?" "Your father was chief standing bear of the Mescalero Apache. His death, and the death of his family, would not go unnoticed by other tribal leaders." Jacob paused, choosing his words carefully. If word were to reach them about what happened, they might feel compelled to respond. Ayanna's eyes widened as she grasped the implications. "You are suggesting that I contact other bands, tell them what happened to my family. I am suggesting that justice sometimes requires more than just official channels. Sometimes it requires the kind of pressure that only comes from people who have the power to make their displeasure felt." It was a dangerous proposition. Encouraging Apache bands to unite in response to the murder of a chief's family could lead to the kind of widespread conflict that would bring federal troops and escalate into full-scale war. But it might also be the only way to ensure that the killers faced consequences for their crimes. "There is a gathering place in the Sangre de Cristo Mountains," Ayanna said thoughtfully. "A sacred valley where chiefs sometimes meet to discuss matters that affect all our people. If I could reach it, if I could tell my story to the assembled leaders." "How far?" Jacob asked. 2 days' ride, maybe 3 depending on the route. Ayanna looked at Jacob with growing hope. "But I would need help getting there. Those men will be watching the trails, waiting for me to make a move." Jacob found himself at another crossroads, another moment when he had to choose between safety and conscience. 6 years of isolation had taught him the value of avoiding entanglements, of staying clear of other people's problems. But looking at Ayanna's face, seeing the trust and hope there, he realized that some problems could not be avoided without abandoning everything that made life worth living. "I know a back route through the mountains," Jacob said. "Trails that most white men have never seen. It would add time to the journey, but it would also avoid the main passes where they might be waiting. You would help me reach the gathering? I would do more than that. I would go with you, add my testimony to yours. A white witness to their crimes might carry weight with territorial authorities." Ayanna stared at him in amazement. "You would risk your life to help seek justice for people you do not even know?" Jacob thought about his answer for a moment. "I spent 15 years trying to bring justice to men who thought they were above the law. I lost that fight, lost my reputation and my career. But maybe this is a chance to win a different kind of battle." They spent the rest of the day preparing for the journey. Jacob packed supplies while Ayanna tended to her injured horse, which would recover but was in no condition for hard travel. Jacob's spare mount, a sturdy mare named Belle, would have to carry Ayanna on what promised to be a dangerous ride through some of the most unforgiving country in the territory. As evening approached, Jacob found himself studying the canyon entrance with the tactical eye of someone expecting trouble. The 3 men who had pursued Ayanna would not give up easily, and they would certainly not allow the only witness to their crimes to escape justice. The question was not whether they would return, but when and in what numbers. The answer came with the dawn. Jacob woke to the sound that had become all too familiar in recent days. Horses, many horses, approaching his canyon at speed. But this time, the sound was different, deeper, more rhythmic, suggesting a much larger group moving with military precision. Jacob climbed onto his roof and felt his blood turn to ice. A line of riders stretched across the Badlands like a dark river, their forms wavering in the morning heat haze. But these were not the crude bounty hunters from yesterday. These were Apache warriors, at least 200 of them, riding in formation with the fluid grace of a people born to the saddle. At the head of the formation rode a man who could only be a war chief, his presence commanding even at this distance. Eagle feathers adorned his long black hair, and traditional war paint decorated his weathered face. He carried himself with the dignity of someone accustomed to leading men in battle, and the way the other warriors looked to him for guidance spoke of absolute authority. Jacob climbed down from the roof and found Ayanna standing in his doorway, her face a mixture of relief and apprehension as she watched the approaching riders. "Do you recognize them?" Jacob asked. "The war banner at the center. That belongs to my uncle, War Eagle of the Northern Mescalero." Her voice carried both hope and concern. "But there are others with him. Warriors from bands I do not recognize." The implications hit Jacob like a physical blow. News of the massacre of Chief Standing Bear's family had apparently spread through the Apache community faster than he had anticipated. What was approaching his canyon was not just a rescue party, but a gathering of war chiefs united by grief and anger over the murder of their kinsman. "How many warriors are we looking at?" Jacob asked, though he was already counting heads in the approaching formation. 200, maybe more. Ayanna's voice carried the weight of someone who understood the political ramifications of what they were seeing. "When word spread that my father's peaceful band was attacked by white men, other chiefs would have been angry. This is not just a search party. This is a council of war." Jacob felt his carefully constructed isolation crumbling around him like sand. For 6 years, he had avoided the conflicts that raged across the frontier. Now he found himself at the center of what could be the largest Apache gathering in recent memory, and at the heart of it all was a teenage girl whose testimony could either prevent a war or ignite one. The war party crested the final ridge and spread out across the valley floor like a human avalanche. Up close, they were even more formidable than Jacob had imagined. These were professional warriors, men hardened by generations of conflict and united by a justified rage against white violence. Their horses moved with practiced precision, and their weapons caught the morning sunlight like promises of vengeance. War Eagle raised his lance, and 200 warriors fell silent, as if commanded by a divine voice. The only sounds were the snorting of horses and the whisper of wind through canyon walls. Jacob had never experienced such focused, potentially hostile attention. He felt like a single white stone on a field of dark earth, visible and vulnerable, and entirely at the mercy of forces beyond his control. The war chief urged his horse forward, leaving his warriors in formation as he approached Jacob's cabin. He rode slowly, deliberately, his dark eyes taking in every detail of the modest ranch. When he was 30 yards away, he stopped and called out in Apache, his voice carrying clearly in the thin mountain air. Ayanna stepped forward and responded in her native tongue, her voice breaking with emotion as she saw her uncle for the first time since the massacre. What followed was a rapid exchange that Jacob could not understand, but whose emotional content was unmistakable. Relief, grief, love, and anger flowed between uncle and niece in the musical tones of the Apache language. Finally, War Eagle held up his hand for silence. He studied Jacob for a long moment, taking in the rancher's weathered appearance, his obvious preparedness for trouble, the way he stood without weapons but also without fear. "You are the white man who saved my niece," War Eagle said in English that was heavily accented but perfectly clear. "I helped her when she needed help," Jacob replied, keeping his voice steady despite the thundering of his heart. "She tells me you stood against 3 armed men to protect her, that you risked your life for someone you had never met." War Eagle's voice carried a note of respect that surprised Jacob. "She also tells me you offered to help her reach the gathering place, to add your testimony to hers about the men who murdered her family." Jacob nodded, not trusting his voice. "These are not the actions of an enemy," War Eagle continued, "but they are also not the actions I would expect from most white men." "Why did you help her?" The question hung in the air between them, loaded with implications that went far beyond the immediate situation. Jacob knew that his answer would determine not just his own fate, but potentially the fate of everyone in the surrounding territory. "Because it was right," Jacob said simply. "Because some things are more important than the color of a person's skin or the language they speak." War Eagle nodded slowly, as if Jacob's answer confirmed something he had hoped to hear. "My niece has told me about the men who killed her family, about their faces, their names, the things they said while they committed their crimes. They called themselves bounty hunters, but they had no badges, no warrants. They were murderers trying to eliminate the only witness to their crimes. Yes, and now that witness sits under your protection, which creates certain obligations." War Eagle's voice took on a ceremonial quality. Among our people, when a man risks his life to save a woman of high standing, bonds of honor are created that must be acknowledged. Jacob felt a chill of premonition. He had heard enough about Apache customs to understand where this conversation was heading. What kind of obligations? He asked. The kind that make you family rather than stranger. The kind that create alliances between peoples who might otherwise be enemies. War Eagle paused, letting the implications sink in. My niece has no father now. No male relative to speak for her or protect her interests. That responsibility falls to me as her uncle and war chief. The magnitude of what War Eagle was suggesting hit Jacob like lightning. Marriage to Ayanna would not only protect her honor according to Apache custom, it would also create family bonds that transcended racial boundaries and potentially prevent the kind of widespread conflict that 200 angry warriors could unleash. You are suggesting marriage, Jacob said. I am suggesting that what appears to be a tragedy might instead be an opportunity. Your people and mine have been enemies for too long. But if a white rancher and an Apache chief's daughter were to join their lives, it would create bonds that might help our peoples find a different path. Jacob looked at Ayanna, who had been listening to the exchange with eyes that held both hope and apprehension. Her expression showed no fear, but also no pressure. Whatever decision he made, she seemed prepared to accept it, with the dignity that seemed to be her defining characteristic. What does Ayanna say about this? Jacob asked. War Eagle spoke to his niece in their native language, and she responded at length. Jacob could not understand the words, but he could hear the strength and certainty in her voice. She says, War Eagle translated, that you have already proven yourself to be a man of honor, that you could have turned her over to her enemies, but instead you protected her at great risk to yourself. She says she would be honored to be your wife, if you will accept the responsibilities that come with such a bond. Jacob felt the world shift around him as he stared into Ayanna's dark eyes. There was trust there, and gratitude, and something that might grow into love given time. But more than that, there was the recognition of a shared purpose, a chance to build something meaningful from the wreckage of recent tragedy. If I agree, Jacob said slowly, what happens to the men who killed her family? Justice will be served, War Eagle said with quiet certainty. But it will be the kind of justice that comes through proper channels rather than through war. Your testimony, combined with my niece's, will be presented to territorial authorities. And if those authorities fail to act, then other measures will be considered. The elegance of the solution was remarkable. Marriage to Ayanna would provide her with protection, while creating bonds that both cultures would understand and respect. More importantly, it would channel Apache anger into legal rather than military action, potentially preventing the kind of widespread conflict that could devastate the entire territory. Jacob stepped forward and offered his hand to War Eagle. I accept your proposal with honor. The ceremony that followed combined elements of both Apache and Christian traditions, conducted in both languages with 200 warriors as witnesses. Ayanna wore wildflowers that she gathered from Jacob's small garden, their bright colors vivid against her dark hair. Jacob wore his best shirt, the one he had kept from his days as a territorial marshal, and felt the weight of his past giving way to the possibility of a different future. When the vows were spoken and the rituals completed, Jacob found himself married to a woman who had brought purpose back to his empty life. As Ayanna took his hand and smiled at him with genuine warmth, he felt something awaken in his chest that he had thought lost forever. The celebration continued through the afternoon, with warriors sharing Jacob's supplies and teaching him songs in their native language. As evening approached, and the time came for the war party to depart, War Eagle spoke privately with his niece, while Jacob watched from a respectful distance. She is your wife now, War Eagle told Jacob as he prepared to mount his horse. But she is still my niece, my responsibility. Her safety and happiness are sacred trusts. I understand, Jacob replied. You have my word. War Eagle nodded, then looked out over the canyon that would now be forever connected to his people through the bonds of marriage. The old ways are changing, he said. What comes next depends on choices made by people like you and me. Choose wisdom over vengeance, and perhaps our peoples can find peace. That night, As Jacob and Ayanna sat by their fireplace planning their journey to the territorial capital to seek justice for her murdered family, she asked him about his fears. "Are you afraid of what this marriage will mean for your life?" Jacob considered the question carefully. "Yes, but I am more afraid of the man I was becoming in this isolation. You have reminded me that some things are worth fighting for." Ayanna smiled, and Jacob felt his heart lift in a way it had not done since his disgrace 6 years earlier. Outside, coyotes called across the Badlands, but the cabin felt warm and alive in a way it never had when he lived there alone. Tomorrow would bring the journey to seek justice, along with all the challenges that would follow. There would be questions from authorities, resistance from those who opposed any cooperation between whites and Apaches, and the ongoing struggle to build a life together across cultural divides. But tonight, Jacob Morrison was no longer alone, and as stars appeared in the clear mountain sky, he dared to hope that his future might hold something more than mere survival. Perhaps it might hold the chance to make a real difference in a world that desperately needed healing.